Good evening, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Shakespeare Hour. My name is Simon Godwin and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, DC. Welcome back, and if it's your first Shakespeare Hour, a special welcome to you. Well, tonight's episode, we're going to be talking about Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and our theme is virtue and vice, good and evil in the two plays. This episode of the Shakespeare Hour has been generously sponsored by Carolyn L. Wheeler. And so thank you so much, Carolyn, for making tonight possible. The Shakespeare Hour is produced as part of our larger online presence, Shakespeare Everywhere. And Shakespeare Everywhere is generously supported by the Beach Street Foundation. Again, many thanks. So now, let me introduce to you our wonderful panelists tonight. I am joined by Kelley Curran, 2019's Emery Battis Award winner and seen at Shakespeare Theatre Company, most recently in the ORESTEIA, and as Lady Percy in the 2014 productions of Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. Hello, Kelley.
Hi, Simon. So lovely to be here.
Nice to see you. Where are you? Where are you tonight, Kelley?
I am in Slingerlands, New York, which is a hamlet outside of Albany.
Oh, wow. Terrific. And what a great Shakespearean chair you have.
Thank you very much. It seemed appropriate.
Extremely. Well, I'd also now love to introduce, it's a great pleasure to introduce, and indeed an honor, Stephen Greenblatt, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and Shakespeare scholar, whose books I read at university, and it's wonderful to be meeting him in person, as it were, tonight. Stephen, hello.
Hello, Simon. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure and an honor. May I ask where you are this evening, Stephen? I'm
in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay, terrific. I'm slowly learning my geography of America, very slowly, at least picturing where you are, even if I haven't necessarily been there. And now to Sam Waterston, award-winning actor of stage, film, and television. Many of you will know his work across all those mediums, and a wonderful Shakespearean actor who played Hal in The Park. Sam, good evening and welcome. Hello, Sam. I think you might be muted, Sam.
That.
Oh, you made it, Sam. How are you doing?
Anyway, yes, I did play Hal in the Park in somewhere back in the 12th century. But
wow, okay, great.
I remember it well. Yeah, and I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very glad to be with all of you. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us. It means so much. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce my co-host, STC Dramatag, Drew Lichtenberg. Hello, Drew.
Hello, Simon. How are you doing?
I'm well. Where are you tonight, Drew?
I am in my basement in front of my wall of books. So, as always, this is my happy place. This is where I come to meditate on Shakespeare. And I wanted to ask you tonight, since we forgot last week, what Shakespeare character are you currently feeling like? I am feeling a little bit like Caliban down in my cave.
Well, I will go first in this trial by fire. Well, I'm still in the countryside. I'm in rural Virginia, about an hour from DC, and this is the Rectortown Methodist Church Hall, which our loyal viewers will be used to by now, which makes me feel like Orlando in the idyllic countryside, trying to read my notes on trees, hopefully from somebody that loves me. That's me.
And Stephen, what Shakespeare character are you feeling like tonight?
I suppose I should say, at least, because I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that I, as a professor, should feel like Prospero, a great mage. But in fact, I think I feel more like Benedict in Much Ado.
Excellent. There are many things that could be said about Benedict. Kelley, what Shakespeare character are you feeling like tonight in particular?
Well, you know, I always kind of aspire to a Kate Percy because she's just such a righteous babe. And, you know, she doesn't like to sing in public, and neither do I, so we have that in common. But I think tonight I actually feel a little bit more like Helena from All's Well That Ends Well. You know, in spite of having some breadth of knowledge about what we're about to leap into, I'm still feeling deeply unworthy to be part of this conversation. So that's where I'm at tonight.
Yeah, I guess I also feel like Wayne in Wayne's World. We're not worthy to be here with Stephen Greenblatt and Sam Waterston. Sam, what Shakespeare character are you feeling like?
Well, first of all, I didn't know that Wayne was a Shakespearean character until tonight. I'm very glad to hear that. and I have no idea who I would want to be. It would be fun to be as young as I was when I played the first part that I ever played in Central Park at the Delacorte, which was Sylvia's in As You Like It. So since you brought up As You Like It, how about that?
A lovelorn shepherd tonight it is.
Yeah.
Definitely, Sam. We can give you the lovelorn shepherd, Sylvius. I think you're still in touch with the spirit. I can feel that.
So before we get started with the theme and the conversation of tonight, we wanted to walk everyone through a few features for this webinar. You all should have a Q&A button and a chat button. Please put any questions you have for us and our guests in the Q&A, and any general comments for everyone else in the chat. And we will get to your questions during the Q&A segment of the show. The theme of the night, as Simon was saying, is good and evil. And the two plays that we're discussing are Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. This is a new genre for us in the Shakespeare Hour, the history play, panoramic in form, political, yet also a mix of the serious and the comic, intense interest in human relationships, I think, is one of the hallmarks of the history play. And the two plays we're talking about, Henry IV, parts 1 and parts 2, for those who may not remember, are not really about Henry IV at all, but are in fact about the evolution of Prince Hal. At the beginning of the play, Prince Hal is spending all of his time in Eastcheap, partying in the tavern with Sir John Falstaff, the fat knight. At the end of part 1, he defeats Hotspur, who is leading this rebellion against his father, King Henry IV. And at the end of part 2, he is crowned King Henry V and rejects Falstaff for reasons that we're going to get into tonight. And we're framing this conversation around good and evil, because what's at stake in the two plays is really Hal and what kind of king he's going to be. Henry V is the end of the second tetralogy, and the end of the first one is Richard III, where we have kind of the nightmare of an English king. And Hal, when he becomes Henry V, ultimately is in many ways the ideal ruler. He's brave, he's inspirational, he's a smart politician. He's able to win in all these various difficult situations that he's put in, and yet he's very much not that person when we start Henry IV, part 1. So I thought we would start with you, Stephen, talking about good and evil in these plays and how Shakespeare dramatizes them.
Well, thank you, Drew. I truthfully don't think that Shakespeare does dramatize good and evil in these plays. He does elsewhere. He knows what evil sounds like. Evil sounds like Iago, or Richard III, whom you've mentioned, or Goneril and Regan, or even in a play like Lear, the loathsome Oswald. He knows what it means to be evil. And likewise, he knows what it means to be unequivocally good. Shakespeare wasn't much for saintliness, but on the other hand, he gives you characters who are sometimes great characters with good, like Cordelia, sometimes modest characters who are innately good, like the servants who come forth in King Lear to put some healing in the eyes of Gloucester. But forget it for Henry IV, part 1 and 2. You're in a different world, a world in which it's very hard to draw a line. You have marvelously rich and complex characters, above all Hal and Falstaff, but I think you have a very hard time deciding on where the boundary is between good and evil. In some sense, Falstaff is the focus of what looks in Henry IV, part 1, like the forces of generosity, warmth, wit, charm, philosophical wisdom, good heavy drinking. At the same time, he is a parasite, he's a lecher, he's a thief, he's a coward, he's a knave, he's an inveterate liar, and he's an exploiter of anyone who comes within 50 yards of him. Hal, as you've said, looks like he's heading toward virtue, toward the goodness of a good ruler, but as we'll explore, I'm sure, he gets there by systematically betraying everyone who trusts him.
Yeah, indeed. Hal is, he's in some way the prototype of Machiavel's that we see in later plays, like Malcolm in the Scottish play, and Fortinbras in Hamlet, and Octavius in Antony and Cleopatra. At least this is my theory. And all of those are supporting characters, whereas Hal is a protagonist. And it's really Shakespeare's great study of a politician, which is not necessarily the same as a good person.
No, far from it. Actually, the play, I think, makes it very clear that success in politics doesn't come to people who are unequivocally virtuous.
And when he becomes King Henry V, he becomes a good king at the cost of his human relationships or his humanity. Which brings us to you, Kelley. You played Lady Percy opposite Hotspur. So you were in the play in a very intimate way. And Hotspur, he's an interesting character. How do you answer this question of good and evil, or vice and virtue, which are different concepts, but are words that come up in the play over and over again?
Well, yeah, I agree with Stephen. I think it's so hard to draw a clear line between good and evil in any of these characters in this play. So I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the good that we find in the characters we associate with vice, and some of the evil that we find in the characters in this play that we normally associate with virtue. You know, when you wrote to me, Drew, one of the questions you posed was, why do the characters that we associate with vice seem to have so much more fun? And, you know, coming to these plays as an actor, I think it's, the simple answer is because they do have more fun. They have more fun with the language. You know, I think like the sounds, the images, the pace, the vitality of the language of the characters in Eastcheap is so delicious and fast and furious and filthy. And Falstaff is such a master of English prose with such a majestic imagination and lightning quick wit. And I think he really nurtures these things in Hal. And to me, in the tavern scene in Henry IV Part 1, you know, it's one of those scenes where they're just going back and forth with this like glorious prose, and Hal seems to enjoy it so much. There's a short passage where he says to Falstaff, "These lies are like their father that begets them, gross as a mountain, open, palpable. Why, thou clay-brained guts, thou naughty-pated fool, thou hoarse and obscene, greasy tallow-catch." And he's just indulging in all this fabulous language. And a few moments later, the sheriff walks in the door. This authority figure walks in the door, who sort of represents, you know, officialdom and the authority that Hal needs to begin to assume. And Hal does a 180 in the architecture of his language and the sounds of his language, and he's suddenly in verse. And he says, talking about Falstaff to the sheriff, "The man, I do assure you, is not here, for I myself at this time have employed him. And sheriff, I will engage my word to thee that I will by tomorrow dinner time send him to answer thee or any man for anything he shall be charged withal, and so let me entreat you leave the house." And to me, it's some of the most dry, dull, regular poetry, verse in the play. And it's this little microcosmic moment that for me illustrates the sort of freewheeling fun Hal is able to have with prose and in the world of Eastcheap, and the sort of responsibility he begins to feel and the burden of poetry and the verse that he has to assume when he assumes his own authority. And to that end, in terms of the conflict between vice and verse and the battle for Hal's soul, you know, that of course plays out in the dynamic of Hal's relationship to his father, the king, versus Falstaff, this sort of mock king, if we think of him as this lord of misrule, or a sort of carnival figure in the, you know, medieval and Tudor carnival traditions. I think the wisdom of the play is maybe not so much that vice and virtue are in battle for Hal's soul, just like you can't really quite parse out good and evil from one another, but rather they work in accord. they work in accord to nurture Hal's understanding of his own soul and his understanding of humanity. Because, you know, the concept of virtue can't really exist without the concept of vice, and rule can't operate without misrule. And as Hal says early on to us, you know, if all the year we're playing holidays to sport would be as tedious as to work, he's very aware that these things sort of cannot operate without the other. So it's interesting to me to pose the thought that, you know, the time he spends in Eastcheap with Falstaff as one of Falstaff's, you know, minions of the moon is what enables him to gain the self-knowledge and gain the knowledge of humanity to become a largesse universal as the sun, as he's later called in Henry V. And I don't think that all kings achieve that. So I think there is some good in the vice-filled world of Eastcheap, just as we find so much evil in the you know, virtue-filled world of the nobles, who can act in so much more unscrupulous ways, like when Hotspur's uncle Worcester and Vernon decide not to tell him of the king's offer to forgive the rebellion and come to an accord of peace. I mean, to me, and probably because I'm biased because I played Hotspur's wife, it's a decision that leads him to his death, and it's one of the most unforgivable sins in the whole play, I think, committed by people who we might otherwise think are good and virtuous.
Well, I think you're putting your finger on something that Stephen also identified, which is this other thing that Shakespeare's dramatizing, other than the simple binaries of good and evil. And we experience that on a linguistic level, as you point out, in the prose, which is so full of life, and then the very dry kind of political verse that he speaks. And there's something about this play. It was the most popular play in Shakespeare's lifetime. 7 quartos were published, which were the single editions, which is, I believe, the most of any Shakespeare play. So there was something about part 1 itself that people couldn't get enough of, even though it wasn't giving them simple good and evil. Which brings me to you, Sam.
So you both speak so beautifully, and I'm going to have to read, I'm afraid. So there's much that can be said about virtue and vice, but if good and evil is a theme of the Henry plays, and of part 1 and part 2 in particular, to me, it's not easy to find. You can go subject by subject. In the play's treatment of politics and state affairs, everyone's claims are shaky. Bolingbroke's claim to the throne is not so good. The Richard you replaced, as Shakespeare wrote him, was less evil than weak, and his sin, if you can call it a sin, is not being good at kingship. And the Henry's good and evil as a theme is hard to find in the affairs of state, except maybe in Henry V, where British nationalism is sometimes presented as the same thing as the good. On the subject of war, in the Henry IVs, though, good and evil doesn't really enter in. Right pretty much belongs to the winners. There is plenty of courage, honor, and fight on display, but it's on both sides of the battle. And who's right on the subject of succession to the throne of England is held as an open question, as it was in Shakespeare's time for those who were still worrying about it, which was lots of people. If picking who was on the good and the evil side was your subject and goal, would you even pick the story of the Plantagenets or the English throne, where questions about legitimacy remain very much alive in the time of Shakespeare and of Queen Elizabeth? There's plenty of cunning and cowardice in Falstaff, and realism too. To the eyes of members of the warrior class in the play, to the aristocrats watching the performance, these are obvious and major sins. Avoiding battle and death are positive goods in Falstaff's eyes, though. And that will have looked a lot less awful to the groundlings than it did to the toffs. The groundlings were nearer in experience to Falstaff's conscripts than to Hotspur and Hal and anyone eager to prove their worth in battle. And over the years, Falstaff's view of things has only spread in Western culture. In our own country today, many a person of high degree and across the whole spectrum of class hardly bothers to disguise it anymore that they'd rather profit than fight. Saying you had better things to do, or getting deferments, or alleging bone spurs as reasons to keep you out of the military service that everybody else was going to, are transparent excuses worthy of Falstaff. But today in this country, it hasn't stopped anyone from becoming president or vice president or from becoming leaders of the free world. And I bring this up not to drag the discussion of good and evil in these old plays into current events, but to underline how similar Falstaff's worldview is to the prevailing worldview today. And Shakespeare would not be in a hurry to say, I think, that one view is good and the other is evil. To all appearances, he's content with the idea that your point of view depends on where you stand, and that people's morals are very much the product of their circumstances. And how that dynamic works is interesting in a way that absolutes are not. As far as general questions of morality are concerned in the Henrys as elsewhere, Shakespeare's attention goes to the question less than to the answer. For proof, you only have to look at the way so many of his plays, having unveiled enormous conflicts and unresolved questions, wrap themselves up suddenly, almost casually, sometimes plain incredibly, to get it all over with at the end. The writer seems fascinated by the conflict and almost indifferent to the resolution. He is keenly interested in philosophy and morals for the questions they raise. His interest is questions that do not resolve, in questions that stay alive. His characters have very strong opinions about right and wrong. Usually they think they're right and their opponents are wrong, or that anything goes, or that everyone's bad, or well, we are all sinners, or he has, in other words, he is and was, in other words, interested in humanity as it comes, which includes lots of differing opinions about good and evil. He was, in other words, made to be a playwright. Shakespeare's views on the question of good and evil showed themselves plainly in these history plays really only on the personal level, in how the characters measure up as people, how truthful, loyal, loving, honest men and women they are, living in the morally ambiguous and muddied world of claims to the throne, shifting loyalties, and to power, struggles being decided by war, where sheer chance matters more than any rules about good and evil. The marriage of Hotspur and Mortimer leaps off the page. Everyone wants a relationship like that. On top of all the frank talk, the obvious affection, the resilience and give and take, and the brightness of mind, the sauciness on both sides, any human with blood in their veins knows that any relationship that sexy has to be good. Harry and his father reconciled. You can feel the good in that. No discussion required. Falstaff and Harry do all kinds of shameful things, even to each other, but we experience that their bond is good, and the breaking of it, while it is necessary to the state and the inevitable result of Hal coming into himself as a man and a king, we know it is not good, and that Shakespeare wants us to feel the ripping and tearing involved, even though you can't call it bad or evil. That's the stuff of tragedy. As Walter Curran wrote when reviewing our production at the Delacorte in the 1970s about the scene of Hal disowning Falstaff in part 2. When something is both indigestible to us and inevitable, that's the stuff of tragedy, not morality. And again, it just goes to show you, Shakespeare was born to be a playwright.
Wow, that was a pretty amazing speech, Sam. You are a wonderful writer as well as a wonderful actor. And you identify all the ways in which Shakespeare very much remains our contemporary. I was thinking as you were speaking about Stephen's book, Tyrant, which came out a year ago, 2 years ago, and which reads like a series of these kinds of essays on how Shakespeare reflects on our political situation today. So I just want to plug that book. I devoured it in a night. I want to get to Simon, but we also have some questions from our guests that I want to get to. Question from Robert Cohen. What do you think of Harold Bloom's take on Falstaff or the take of Orson Welles, which are a reference to Harold Bloom, the late Yale professor's, I think, chapter on the plays in Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, where he really goes on and on about Falstaff. He loves Falstaff. And Orson Welles, of course, famously played Falstaff in his film adaptation, Chimes at Midnight, making Falstaff the main character of the two plays instead of Hal. Does anyone want to respond to that question?
Well, maybe I'll have a crack at least the beginning of an answer, Drew. Since Harold Bloom was one of my teachers, these many years ago, it is certainly the case that the reason that the play was this enormous popular success in Shakespeare's time had everything to do with Falstaff. Had something to do with the rest of the story, but we know from contemporary references that Falstaff absolutely seized everyone's imagination. And it's a little bit connected to the things that Sam has already said so wonderfully well. Look, these plays were written at a time in which everyone was required to go to church weekly and listen to what they called homilies, official sermons that they had to be read out that told you just to obey, shut up and obey, and do whatever the people above you told you to do. It was a play in which, this was a time rather, in which if you said anything at the tavern about any of the people in power, you could get your tongue bored through, or you could have your ears cut off. This was a time of absolutely no free speech. So it makes the plays in general, as Sam has so well described them, astonishing because they're so frank about what it is to take a serious view of how things are organized in society and who gets screwed and who doesn't get screwed. And at the same time, it has at its center this enormous, outrageous Lord of Misrule, as Kelley called him. I mean, who is outrageous, delightful, calls everything into question, finds the whole cult of honor ridiculous. So you can see that as also is linguistically fantastic, as Kelley has said. But I have to say, I don't want to betray my late teacher, but a completely uncritical view of Falstaff is absurd. He's responsible for the deaths of the people that he brings, literally responsible. I mean, he is indifferent to them. Food for powder, he says. He just basically leads them into death. He can collect then for them. He's a son of a bitch. And he's very clearly that in the play. So it won't do simply to get weepy about him.
Yeah, I think that there's a key moment halfway through Henry IV Part 1 where Hal goes and sees his father and kind of gets yelled at and says, I will promise to be good, I'll go fight Hotspur, and he wrangles a commission for Falstaff in that meeting. And then Falstaff embezzles the money and finds a bunch of basically no-hopers who are going to get shot to bits in this battle. And that's a real thing that he does. He is a thief. He's a criminal. He's a war criminal, for Christ's sakes. So it's fascinating how Shakespeare seduces us into loving Falstaff in the first half of the play, and then shows us all of his failures as a human being. There's another question from James Carr. And Kelley, you spoke about Hal and his evolution, so I'll give this one to you. Do you think Hal's evolution is shaped in part by the fact that his father has usurped the throne? He has deposed Richard II in the previous play and had him murdered. Could Hal have been reaching out to the common people in part because his father keeps himself locked up in the castle with a guilty conscience away from them?
You know, that's an interesting thought, and I think it sort of goes back to that question of how is this young prince on this journey to figure out what is good, what is evil, how does vice play in my life, how does virtue play in my life. I have the burden, this like burden of this yoke of needing to become a king, and do I even want it? And to me, it's a thing he remains sort of ambivalent about, even to a degree in the Henry V, and that whole speech about ceremony and what is, ceremony. So it's interesting to think of maybe that springing from his father's sort of the way he got the crown. And I remember, I'm going to butcher this, but on his deathbed, Henry IV describes it as like the bypaths and the crooked means by which I achieved this crown, or, something to that effect. So even at the end of his days and near the end of his time in the play, he finally sort of owns up to that, which he's been defending the whole time. And it's one of the last things he shares with Hal. So the impression that must leave on him, and what Hal has to learn from that. It's an interesting thing. It sort of speaks to the same duality in Falstaff. Stephen, I think you used the word Machiavellian to describe him, and it can be so true too. It's a very complicated thing. He becomes this great king, but he's not without his political faults and tricky ways, and I think it's sort of like the great struggle of his whole life.
Simon, we are at 8, so I wonder if you could do 2 things for us. One is talk a little bit about these plays, but also if you could update us on the status of the Phoenix Fund, which is this online initiative that we have launched in order to rise from the ashes during this difficult time.
Well, thanks, Drew. Yes, to move from the world of Shakespeare to the world of Shakespeare Theatre Company right now in the middle of this pandemic. We have indeed been raising money to help our staff and to help the theatre survive this and make sure that we come roaring back to deliver Shakespeare on our stages. It's called the Phoenix Fund, and I'm really delighted to say we are extremely close to our goal, of our immediate goal of $1 million to stabilize the organization, to get through this emergency before we can start to work out how we're going to come back. So we have an amazing trustee that's matching every dollar that people have been giving. So we're nearly at $1 million, which is an amazing milestone to reach. So thank you to everybody, all our listeners who have given to the Phoenix Fund already. If you haven't had the chance yet, if you can and you feel able to, please do. Every dollar counts. Actually, every dollar counts twice that you're able to give. So thank you so much. And if you want to give, of course, you can go on our website where you'll see the Phoenix page details.
May I add something?
Yes, please do.
I think it's one of the most astonishing things about this time that the last time the theaters were closed for a plague was Shakespeare's time. And Shakespeare came out of that one, so we ought to have some hope.
Yeah.
But if you're going to have hope, the theaters have to survive.
Yeah, that's right. I completely agree with you. He's been an inspirational example of somebody that when his theatre closed, he went to the countryside and he wrote Macbeth and King Lear. So he rolled up his sleeves and thought, how can I use this time for maximum effect and benefit? And it just reminds us that creativity is the panacea. And we're definitely holding on to that. And look, it may well be that when we come back, we start doing plays outside in a much more Shakespearean style than we've ever done before. Outside, more simply, more based around the actor and the experience of what is close to each other, but not too close to each other. So I think there are lots of provocations from Shakespeare, as always.
So Sam, before we took the break, Kelley was talking about this extraordinary scene in Henry IV, Part 2, which you didn't play at the Park, but in my opinion is one of the most amazing scenes in all of Shakespeare, along with the end of Part 2, where he renounces Falstaff. And it's the scene where Hal thinks his father is dead and picks up the crown and puts it on his head and gets caught in the middle of it. So you played Prince Hal. I wonder if you've prepared any passage of text, or if you have any sort of comment to make about Hal's evolution in the play.
Well, I was, when I was looking for a text, I was looking for a text that proved my point that going looking for good and evil in this play was a kind of a fool's errand. And so I came up with not a quote from Hal, but a quote from Falstaff, where Prince Hal says to Falstaff, well, thou owest God a death. And Hal left, and Falstaff left by himself says, 'tis not due yet. I would be loath to pay him before his day. What need I be so forward with him that calls not on me? Well, 'tis no matter, honor pricks me on, yea, but how if honor prick me off when I come on? How then? Can honor set to a leg? No. Or an arm? No. Or take away the grief of a wound? No. Honor hath no skill in surgery? Then no. What is honor? A word. What is that word, honor? Air, a trim reckoning. Who hath it? He that died a Wednesday. Doth he feel it? No. Doth he hear it? No. 'Tis insensible then? Yea, to the dead. But will it not live with the living? No. Why? Detraction will not suffer it. Therefore, I'll none of it. Honor is a mere scutcheon, and so ends my catechism. That does seem to me to be sort of the baseline from which people depart nobly and bravely sometimes, and cowardly and awfully other times. But, you know, I think the tone of Falstaff is, you know, anyone of you want to contradict me? Anybody out there in the audience want to say me nay? Because isn't it like this, really? Come on.
And this, of course, is the scene, I believe, right before, he's been pretending to be dead on the battlefield so he doesn't get in any scrapes. And Hal has laboriously killed Hotspur, who is the embodiment in the play of honor, of all these medieval, militaristic, masculine, warlike notions of how a knight should behave. And Falstaff kind of wakes up at the last moment and claims the kill as his own, which is another one of those moments, just like him calling these transcripts food for powder, where we're and even as you were reading that, Sam, I was kind of agreeing with Falstaff. You find yourself agreeing with him in the moment, and then finding his behavior to be deplorable, I guess, is the
to my point about where the good lies, when Falstaff claims that he killed Hotspur, the person who was going, according to Hal himself, was going to make Hal's reputation. Hal lets him have it. It's okay. You want to claim it? What the hell? Which is personal and loyalty, and, you know.
Not to give Hal too much credit, or at least too much humanity, that moment follows the moment at which he sees Falstaff's body, thinks Falstaff is dead, and speaks very remarkably coldly for someone who was in effect his surrogate father. I could have spared a better man. Poor Jack, farewell. Now you could play it, you could do anything, you could play it poignantly, but actually, in some sense, Hal has been grappling from the beginning of the play whether he cares about anyone except himself. He's constantly questioning whether he actually has any connection to any other person, deep connection to any other person in the world.
Here's the thing that's fun from my experience of doing it, I think, and it completely supports what you said. When I was cast in that play, I looked enough like Tony Perkins in those days. I was very skinny and slight, and that we were confused for each other, but on the street, which infuriated me. And until one day I ran into Tony Perkins on the street, and he said, "Say, do people ever come up to you and say, 'Are you Tony Perkins?'" And I said, "Yes." He said, "People come up to me all the time and say, 'Are you Sam Waterston?'" And I said, "What do you say?" He said, "Thank you." Which was an extraordinary lesson. But I began doing the Henrys, thinking that Hal was a troubled youth. But you say the words over and over and over again, and eventually they assert themselves on you. And one night, at the beginning of that scene in the tavern where he's bored, and the one that ends with him saying, "I will be like the sun and astound everybody," I realized that Hal, when he's not happy, looks around for who's to blame. He does not look to himself. And then I couldn't play it like Tony Perkins anymore after that. I mean, there just wasn't any way to say that he was an inner troubled psyche.
Yes.
And this, of course, you're speaking, Sam, about the play extempore scene in the middle of part one, which is really it's amazing when you start talking about these plays, one famous scene after the next. There are so many iconic scenes, and it's where Falstaff pretends to be Hal, arguing on behalf of not banishing Falstaff, and Hal pretends to be the king.
It's been a long time since I did the play, but those two, is that the scene, or is it just the scene where he gets up late one morning and he's kind of hungover, and does it even lead anywhere? I can't remember, but he's got a store ahead and somebody else is going to pay. I feel lousy. Somebody's going to fix this or pay for it.
We have a question from Andrew Shipley, who writes, as I understand it, the Henry IV plays were staged with great success. Sorry, the Henry VI plays began Shakespeare's career by being staged with great success. So in creating this character of Hal and his transformation into Henry V, was Shakespeare winking at the audience as if to say, enjoy the ride, but keep in mind that the transformation of this vice-filled Hal into the virtuous Henry V was all for nothing, that all of the things he wins in France are going to be lost in the reign of King Henry VI, and it will lead to the bloodiest civil war in English history in Richard III.
Well, he sort of says that at the end of Henry V, doesn't he? I mean, in the epilogue of Henry V, he mentions very quickly that all of this glory actually didn't last very long. So he anticipates exactly what your questioner.
But Steve, am I right, Stephen, in thinking that Shakespeare essentially wrote 10 history plays, but he wrote the later 5 chronologically first, and then he went back and he wrote the early plays afterwards. I don't know whether you can explain that to our viewers more clearly than I managed to.
No, you're right, of course. He started with the Henry VI plays, then he went back to Richard II and worked through. I mean, he didn't work in chronological order. The only thing he made sure was that he kept a certain safe distance from his contemporary world. So Walter Raleigh was in prison in the Tower, and he wrote the history of the world that began with Genesis. And someone asked him, why didn't you write about your own time? You knew everyone and everything. And he said, if you follow truth too close on the heels, you can get your teeth kicked out. So Shakespeare knew that very well. Good to write about about late medieval England as a way of writing about his own contemporary world.
We have a question from Terry Quist, who accuses us of being anachronistic in our thinking. Could we be thinking out of context, expecting one definition of virtue in both the private and public spheres? Even though Hobbes and Locke would come later, so we're getting into some political theory, Shakespeare very much lived in a Hobbesian world. Politicians use behaviors that are evil in private and public life to gain and maintain power, but stable and hopefully wise power is essential for peace and prosperity. Falstaff's cynical private roguishness was not conducive to encouraging development of responsibility on the part of Hal, but he grew into that responsibility, which was the bottom line of political virtue. I'm not sure if I entirely understand the question, but I think it's about the difference between the
very complex question, but I would give this sort of simplified answer, which is that order comes with a lot of problems, but it beats chaos every day of the week.
This reminds me of something, Stephen, that you've written on part 1, that the play dramatizes or shows us authority's constant production of its own radical subversion and the powerful containment of that subversion. That maybe it's better not to think of virtue and vice or good and evil as opposites, but rather as products of one another, that they are in this constant ebb and flow. And in fact, if you have more Falstaff in your production, it changes the political meaning of the play. The bigger the star, the more Wellesian or Orson Wellesian Falstaff is, the more radically subversive Henry IV Part 1 is.
I mean, I want to go back for a second to something that Sam said in his first remarks about what it is to be a playwright. Because I turn the question back in some sense on you, on all of us. What is it that we're applauding for when we feel excited and moved and thrilled by seeing Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 for that matter? What is it that we're at the theater for? You could say, as your questioner said, and I think it was a very eloquent articulation of that principle, we're applauding the restoration of order. We're applauding the fact that Hal has the wit to betray his friends and to establish himself as a good king. And no doubt that is what we're doing. But really, that's not all we're doing. Something else is going on. And that's why we care about these plays and not simply about the political speeches that were given in the time. Telling you what a great thing kings were, because we allow some kind of resistance to that to rise, some sense that it's all bullshit, that we're being robbed, that we're being taken into battles that we don't want to fight. And we could say that at the end, we put this to sleep and we applaud order, but that's not all that we're doing. And that's why the plays are still alive.
But I would just add to that that the other thing that keeps them alive is that they're not dead because the questions don't resolve. I stole this from my son, who was the first one who said it. He said that his favorite line in Shakespeare is Bottom's line, "For it hath no bottom." And I think that's why we keep coming back, because these plays have no bottom. You say, oh yeah, it's about the restoration of order. And then you say, oh, and yet on the other hand, and things are alive and in tension with each other, and they just won't resolve. And they hurt.
Exactly. Talking of hurting, I just also want to, I think Stephen has also put this wonderful question to us all about why are we seeing these plays? What do they offer us? What is the, and I'm going to use consciously the word experience, because I think they offer us an experience, an experiential encounter. And I think some of us out there, I certainly as a director, feel always hesitant about the history plays, because I worry about how I'm going to make them sufficiently vital, interesting, and to be honest, emotional. Particularly for all of us that don't know the history that well, they can seem daunting and intimidating. And I think that's partly why Falstaff is such a figure of such gravity, that we go towards him because he's so larger than life. But I think there's a very emotional axis in these plays that I was encountering as I was rereading them this time. And it is to do with this notion of betrayal, of recognition and betrayal. And I think that it was great, Sam, when you spoke about those lines of Prince Hal, who's this ambitious but idle young guy who's hanging out with Falstaff and all his friends in the pub that happens in part 1. And that great speech that you referred to, which I wrote down here, which is him coming forward to the audience and saying, I know you all, and will a while uphold the unyoked humour of your idleness. Yet herein will I imitate the sun, who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world, that when he please again to be himself, being wanted, he may be more wondered at by breaking through the foul and ugly mists of vapours that did seem to strangle him. So he's deliberately occluding himself in this rough entourage. He's hiding his sort of majesty, which then if we leap forward right to the end of Henry IV Part 2, we have this, I think, unbearably moving moment, whatever Falstaff has done, where Hal is made into the king. He's been crowned and he's going through the streets on his coronation parade, and Falstaff is right there in the audience, just like those footage we see of the royal weddings in Windsor Castle or Buckingham Palace. And he calls out to Hal. He says, let me get it. He says, God save thee, my sweet boy. And Hal turns to him and says these lines. I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester. I have long dreamt of such a kind of man, so surfeit swelled, so old, and so profane. But Being awaked, I do despise my dream. And we learn that Falstaff, abandoned, dies of a broken heart. And in that moment, I think in the audience there's a feeling of going, we have all been Prince Hal at some point in our lives. Rejecting, denying, thrusting aside someone who loved us. And we have all been Falstaff. We have all been the rejected. The person who is no longer required, who is surplus to requirements, who is not known. And that's, I think, why these plays also have this incredible metaphorical or even biblical resonance. I think that line, I know thee not, in fact, comes from St. John, I think. The notion of being seen and being unseen. And it's not that these plays are kind of blancmange-like studies where no one is bad or good. It is everybody moves from being bad to good, to being bad to being good, to move from vice to virtue and back to vice. That the passage and the dynamism of feeling is something that I think Shakespeare is consistently drawn to.
In other words, it may be impossible to locate or identify good and evil in this play, in these plays, and yet it is pregnant at every moment, in every dramatic encounter between characters.
Yeah.
Which I think is a very big idea.
One of the things that's so fantastic about Shakespeare's dramaturgy is that it's not only that we, of course, we hear that soliloquy which you just read us, Simon. I will uphold for a moment and then I'm going to, but and it's just for us. But the other characters are always trying to figure out what the other one is thinking. And above all, Falstaff, you can feel, is always trying to decide whether Hal really is just the cold Lancastrian that his brother, for example, is in part 2, or whether he has some other kind of loyalty or feeling. And he's always trying himself to maneuver in relation to that perception. And you have to, because you're in dangerous water, you're swimming in dangerous waters. So that you're watching, you yourself are trying to figure out, and the other characters are trying to figure out what's going on in their heads and where they are in the trajectory that you described.
You have a question from Barbara Sirota, and I'm going to give this one to you, Kelley, to get you involved in the conversation. Can you comment on the difference between Hotspur's honor and the finally evolved and improved Prince Hal? It's something we touched on earlier, this dichotomy or parallelism between the two characters.
Sure. Yes, I think Hotspur knows how he feels about honor in a way that Hal doesn't. I mean, Hotspur's whole life, his whole singular sort of cosmology is built on honor. Oh, esperance, the thing he shouts in his drawing room before he leaves. And I think Hal questions it in a Falstaffian way until the beginnings of his sort of reformation into this prince and into this eventual king. But I also just want to follow up on something that Simon said. I love what you said, Simon, when you said, so much of the heart of these plays is about being seen or unseen. And I think that's something that is so compelling to me about the Percys, about Kate and Hotspur and the way they see each other. And Sam described it so beautifully, like you just know their relationship is good in this physical, visceral way. You can feel it, you can sense it, because they're two characters that see each other so beautifully. And Lady Percy only appears in one scene in Henry IV Part 2. She's on stage just for one moment only, but she gives a speech that I think is one of the most beautiful elegies ever written in like the history of Western literature. All about Hotspur and Hotspur's honor. And
some of it, Kelley. Can we hear some of it? Can we hear?
Oh, yes. She's talking to her. Just stop me when you want to stop me. But she's talking to her father-in-law, who's about to leave for the wars, and he wasn't there the first time. He wasn't there to back his son the day his son died. And she says, "Oh, yet for God's sake, go not to these wars. The time was, Father, that you broke your word when you were more endeared to it than now. when your own Percy, when my heart's dear Harry threw many a northward look to see his father bring up his powers, but he did long in vain, who then persuaded you to stay at home? There were 2 honors lost, yours and your son's. For yours, the God of heaven brighten it. For his, it stuck upon him as the sun in the grey vault of heaven, and by his light did all the chivalry of England move to do brave acts. He was indeed, I'm doing this by memory, so forgive me.
It's amazing.
And she goes on to say, you know, he was indeed the mark and glass, the copy and book. Oh my gosh, you guys, I have to find it and read it, because it's so beautiful how she says, you know, she has this line where she says, those who could speak low and tardily would turn their own perfection to abuse to seem like him, so that in speech, in gait, in diet, in affections of delight, in military rules, humors of blood, he was the mark and glass, copy and book that fashioned others, and him, oh wondrous, him, oh miracle of men, him did you leave, second to none, unseconded by you, to look upon the hideous god of war and disadvantage, to abide a field where nothing but the sound of Hotspur's name did seem defensible, so you left him. And it's just stunning. Oh,
everyone is clapping. Yeah, we're all clapping, Kelley. That was wonderful.
I mean, it's just her description of how he understood honor and how his understanding of honor influenced the people around him and influenced the other soldiers and his other countrymen. It's just so astonishing and so moving, and I think it speaks so beautifully to that idea of she saw him, and not only did she see him, but she saw how others saw him, and she loved him for it. And I think it's it's just such a glorious relationship.
Can I just add that what this makes me think of more and more over and over again, and it's because it reinforces what I already think, no doubt. But so take it for what it's worth. But what really the question in the play is not who's good and who's bad, but who is wholly human. And Hal is wholly human. I think it's reductive to say that he's a cold Lancaster. And Hotspur is crazy, stupid, rash, irrational, OCD, but boy is he human. And boy is that a human pair.
Yes, there is an excess of humanity in these plays. I think if you were to define a history play, it is the
Stephen wants to come in with that, I think.
So I was going to say that the what was beautiful about Kelley's reading is that it provided the bookend. This was an hour that began with Sam reading the Falstaff on honor, on the worthlessness of honor, and it's totally persuasive. As you said, Sam, I mean, we all agreed. And then Kelley reads that magnificent speech, and suddenly you feel, I get it. I get why this is a value worth holding on to. So the play manages to have both in a remarkable way.
Well, I think on that note, we have learned something here about maybe not the answer to the question that we started with, but something about the nature of Shakespeare's writing. And I think this inquiry has been a very productive one. Simon.
I'm inspired by what Stephen was saying in our discussion tonight about giving us a sense of what it feels like to be Shakespeare. In that if our minds are working with this degree of activation, this degree of curiosity, this degree of suspicion about any fixed point, maybe, and Stephen's description of the historical age in which Shakespeare lived, the vigilance and the care about codes and language and what things meant, and what they were allowed to mean and could mean, as well as his passionate curiosity about what it feels like to live fully, has yes, has evoked, I've felt more proximate to Shakespeare over the last hour through our conversation than maybe I have before.
Maybe time for one last question, which I think is a really, really interesting one from Bill Braithwaite. Given the censorship of the time, why was Shakespeare's writing acceptable to those in power, whom on some level he was writing about?
Well, maybe the last word should go to Stephen on that.
He was extremely good at staying out of jail. He had an uncanny sense of how far he could go, unlike his contemporary Christopher Marlowe, who wound up with a knife stuck over his eye. Shakespeare had a sense that he could go quite far, because he's, after all, living in a world of other complex people who have the same struggles with the meaning of things that we have. But he understood that he could find a way to say it within the theater. So we come back to Sam's sense of what it is to be a playwright. Within the wooden walls of the playhouse, you could say things that you would be killed for saying outside those walls. And Shakespeare was the supreme genius at figuring out how to do that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our guests. I can say that this has been really a thrill and a privilege and an honor to be with you for this hour. Next week's theme is identity and ambiguity. We will be discussing Twelfth Night and As You Like It for all of our lovelorn Sylviuses out there. And we will be joined by a special guest, Michael Urie, star of stage and screen, and others who we will be announcing shortly. So thank you all. Simon, do you have any last words?
Well, a huge thank you to Sam, Kelley, and Stephen for making this such an incredible hour. On behalf of Shakespeare Theatre Company and all our subscribers and all our audiences and all the people that are tuning in this evening, thank you for making Shakespeare live. We need it more than ever, for giving up your time, your wisdom, your expertise. And I really hope to see you at the theatre in DC very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelley. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. This really was such a privilege.
Your reading of that was so beautiful, really unbelievably beautiful. It was great.
Oh,